right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Can I do this? Welcome to this fourth evening of 5-day-long propositions number 9, Deserting from the Culture Wars. Thank you, those of you who have returned numerous times, numerous days, and I really welcome new faces joining us here as well. I would like to welcome you, as said, also on behalf of the entire team of BAC, and just say a couple of words just to articulate the context for this gathering. As many of you know, in the meantime, we're meeting at the convergence of two main projects. Probably, as I hope many of you had the chance to see the exhibition or the project called Trainings for the Not Yet, which is an exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together otherwise, which has been convened together with a multitude of collaborators by artist Jeanne van Heijswijk. And it's precisely this yearning, this notion of, this yearning for being together otherwise, yearning for another relationality, if you will, that have prompted the entire series of propositions for non-fascist living. A research and program trajectory at BAC that we started back in 2017. And this entire trajectory is, of course, prompted by the resurgence of fascism into public life, one could say globally. Yet fascism as such is decidedly not the theme, not the subject to research. The idea behind the project is, of course, to combine critique, this instinct to resist this condition, to combine the critique with proposition. Indeed, this yearning for not yet as another future and another world, and do it by being together, learning from one another, collectively imagine another possibility, and practice this other relationality. Now, propositions number 9 zooms in or focuses on the ideological combat that is culture wars. I think it's extraordinarily important to remember the date today and what is happening in the Netherlands at this very moment. And in this context, I would like to read out a letter put together by a number of culture workers and organizers today, in the meantime signed by around 300 culture workers or workers at culture institutions, just to keep this particular moment in mind. And of course, it's a letter of support of Kick Out Zwarte Piet that comes from art and culture workers in the Netherlands. With this letter, we call for support and solidarity with Kick Out Zwarte Piet, KOZP, who are taking the streets in the weekend of 16 and 17 November 2019 in multiple cities in the Netherlands and in Curaçao to speak out against Zwarte Piet and this racist blackface tradition. Today, the world is watching The Hague and its Sinterklaas intocht after pakjesboot number 70 parks ashore in Scheveningen. Since years, the rights to protest and the freedom of expression have been violated over this innocent kids' party. The struggle against Zwarte Piet has exposed the deeply rooted racism in the Dutch society. Those who spoke out publicly against Zwarte Piet encountered extreme verbal and physical violence, from online hate speech, death threats, and the shameless misinterpretation of the media to the excessive police violence during protests. The past years, the violence of the police who were repressing peaceful protests shifted to an increased violence from bystanders and so-called concerned citizens. This violence, directed to those who took action against the racist tradition, is a sign of the racist prejudices defended and held high. With the rise of the anti-racist movement, the radicalization of the pro-Pieten also took an organized form. Like with the action from the Blokkeervriezen in 2017, many of us remember, when a group of Frisians decided to block KOZP's Kick Out Zwarte Piet's Freedoms bus on their way to the intocht in Yaoure. Last week in The Hague, a group of 40 people attacked the building where KOZP was holding their conference. They attacked with fireworks, broke the windows, and destroyed the car of two key figures of KOZP. These attacks seem to be fueling other hooligans in the Netherlands. Hooligans in The Hague and Groningen, as well as neo-Nazi group Pegida, have announced their presence at the different intochten in the country, threatening the anti-Zwarte Piet protesters. Their public presence and aggression is just one of many testifying to the increasing fascism, also here in this country. Many of us have been raised with the racist blackface caricature Zwarte Piet. Bad children were to fear him because he'd beat you with his roux and put you in his sack to be taken on the boat back to Spain. He'd make merry too, acting the fool, and for years spoke with a Surinamese accent. Few recognized his big red lips, afro wig, golden earrings, and servant outfit as a colonial leftover, or understood that Zwarte Piet was supposed to be an enslaved person. Protests against Zwarte Piet have been taking place since the 1950s, but it was only in 2011 that his story reached the mainstream media to stay there until he would be abolished. During the intocht at Dordrecht, activist Quincy Gario, Bug Research Fellow in 2017-2018, and Jerry Afrier brought there the Zwarte Piet is Racisme campaign by being present with the text on their shirts. They were violently arrested. Probably not for the first time in history, but on a scale like never before, the topic of race and institutional racism in the Netherlands entered the public debate. Protests against the racist stereotypes of Zwarte Piet returned every year, and its mobilization has inspired the rise of a strong anti-racist movement. In 2015, the United Nations issued a statement urging the Netherlands to get rid of this racist tradition. The figure of Zwarte Piet is changing because of the work of the Black movement and their allies. Still, more celebrations and also the nationally broadcasted Sinterklaas news introduce Roetveegpiet instead of Zwarte Piet. He's closer to the fairy tale reason that Zwarte Piet is black because of the chimney, but in reality he's often so smudged that he's basically still black or just brown. His costume hasn't improved. Michel Assayas, also a Bug Research Fellow, calls the Roetveegpiet a cosmetic solution if it is not accompanied by adapting the educational system and curriculum to learn about the influence Dutch colonial history still has at present. People's minds are changing, slow and steady, but we are not yet there. Zwarte Piet continues to be celebrated all over the country while his likeness is still sold in the shops. The racial stereotype remains part of the Dutch national imagination, and the abolition of Zwarte Piet is long due. The demands are clear: a Sinterklaas celebration for every child in 2020 Netherlands, free of Zwarte Piet. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Jonas Staal has just informed me that apparently, according to the website, this program starts at 7:30, not at 7. So we may be joined by some latecomers who trusted the website, I suppose. Yes, on this day, on this evening about collaborations, coalitions, in and exclusions, we should indeed also be aware of the present absence of those who cannot be here because of their commitment to kick out Zwarte Piet, in particular Mitchell, one of the Bug fellows. It also really got me thinking again, and actually the past days have also had that effect, about the tension between, on the one hand, Michel Foucault's notes about the fascism in all of us, right? This is what started the Bug project, propositions for non-fascist living. There's this text by Foucault, Preface to Anti-Oedipus, in which he discusses the fascism in all of us, in our heads, in our behavior, the fascism that makes us desire power, etc. I've really been thinking of the tension between that fascism in all of us and the fascist in front of us, or the fascists in front of us, right? So the fascists who maybe brandishing weapons, who may be banging at the door or smashing cars, right? Obviously, those are not quite the same, I would say, but it is important to think about this constellation. It is important to also think about how one could slide into the other, how a certain kind of implicit fascism can become an explicit, organized and ideological fascism. What we've seen also in The Hague, for instance, in particular, more broadly in Holland, is that with Kick Out Zwarte Piet, that in a move very familiar, that a move that recurs throughout the culture wars, the calling out of sponsors of the Sinterklaas festivities in The Hague by Kick Out Zwarte Piet has then been weaponized, has then been instrumentalized, not just by out-and-out fascists, but also by right-wing media more broadly, to actually turn Kick Out Zwarte Piet into the perfect enemy. Because, hey, here we have Kick Out Zwarte Piet spoiling our fun and actually being intolerant, right? And threatening sponsors, right? So Kick Out Zwarte Piet, in calling out the sponsors and asking them, do you really want to support this, are put in the position of the intolerant enemy of our freedom of speech, etc., etc., etc. So we once again have that move. And once again, we have a movement becoming the perfect enemy. So this kind of typecasting, in a sense, I would say also constitutes a problem, which of course is not to say that one should not continue with calling out those who support Zwarte Piet. This is not to say that one should not be part of or in solidarity with that movement, that group. Here we also have this notion of solidarity again that we discussed yesterday. However, it is still worthwhile, I think, and indeed profoundly necessary, to also wonder about tactics that can complement this kind of full frontal attack, hence the somewhat provocative use of this notion of desertion, a notion which, as we've discussed, really came to the fore in 70s and 80s autonomism, and which in turn was also indebted to and was a kind of a displacement of notions from the black radical tradition, in particular that of fugitivity. So how can a desertion, a movement of flight during which one looks for a weapon, how can that actually also be used to develop strategies that would allow one to shift the terms of debate and to actually escape this typecasting, right? So how could one move from the position of being the perfect enemy who seems to fit the script of, let's say, the fascists all too perfectly, the cultural Marxists, the feminazis, etc. How could one indeed develop promises, to return to Bini Adamczak's terminology, right? Yesterday in her brilliant lecture, Bini discussed the Fordist and social democratic promise: work hard, be a productive member of this society, and you will be off better, and you will have a certain sort of safety net, a social safety net. There was the neoliberal promise: be an autonomous individual, work hard, and you will somehow be able to avoid the general decline of the economy, the worsening of conditions. You will still be fine as this neoliberal individual autonomous war machine. With the collapse of that promise, indeed, the fascist promise has once again come to the fore. So sure, things will get worse. Things will get steadily worse. We're not promising anything else, but we will help you to defend your privileges as, for instance, a white male subject. And of course, in that context, we need this strengthening of oppositions between this race and that race, this nation and that nation, the white majority and the immigrants, the traditional genders, and all the weirdness and ungodly chaos of gender ideologues, and so on and so on. So scapegoating and basically white nationalists or neo-fascist identitarianism. In that context, questions of organization in the broadest sense, not necessarily in a highly formal or formalized sense, I think are of crucial importance. This is something that we will return to in the panel when, for instance, Natascha Sadr Haghighian will discuss the notion of collaboration in relation to that of collectivity. So actually the distinction between collaboration and collectivity. She will also discuss the individual artist, the continuing fetishization of the individual artist in the contemporary cultural sphere, which of course problematizes notions such as collaboration and collectivity. And she will also, I think, reference back to Bini Adamczak's talk from last night. Then, of course, Bini herself and Jonas Staal will be part of this panel as well, the panel on collaborations, coalitions in and exclusions. We have that to look forward to, but first we have, as is usual, and for the last time, a report from this afternoon's training session. So every afternoon for the past 4 days, we had a training session, and in the public program, we kind of we report on and reflect on that training session, and today's training session was organized by Terra Critica, a platform or a para-institution founded by Birgit Kaiser and Katrin Thiele. And this afternoon's training session was a reading room on Refuge, Refuse, and Refrain, centering on or taking cues from a chapter from Fred Moten's book, The Universal Machine. This training session will indeed now be reported on by Birgit and Katrin, so I'm not going to preempt them, but during the training session or toward the end, we also considered indeed the form of this presentation, this representation itself. But I'm sure that Katrin and Birgit will also say a few words about that. So the floor is yours, Birgit and Katrin.
Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you very much also again for inviting us, and Bak for inviting us to do this training. Katrin and I decided that it should just be me standing here for a second, because we as a group this afternoon decided that if we think about other forms of conversing with each other, which our practice of Reading Room is very much about, then it may not make sense for one person or two people to represent what we've been doing, but to rather have the collective speak a little. So I'm just here as the brief opening, and then we've decided to show you slides that are collected from the thoughts people had at the end of our session, what they took away from the session, questions that came up around deserting or fugitivity, which Moten speaks about in that text. How does one collectively, but also as a soloist, which is a more complicated notion of the single being which consents to not being a single being. How does one turn from things, desert things without just falling into the same of a mere negation or a mere denial of that which one attempts to desert from. Our practice is very much, as I said, about conversing with each other, reading with each other text-based, and studying together. So we hope that our impression of quotes will give you a sense of what we have been conversing about. Importantly, as we also felt in this session, led by Moten, we needed to listen to the music that he's speaking about, or that he's speaking with, almost more than about. So while we show you the slides with our thoughts of the group of this afternoon, you will also be listening to one of the artists that that is underlying his text. So I hope this works, and that's let's see. So thank you again for having us.
Cause some people manners in your way. No more tears do we cry. And we have finally dried our eyes. We're moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. We're moving on up. We're living proof and all's alert that we're two from the good black dirt. And we're a winner. And everybody knows it too. We just keep on pushing. Like your leaders tell you to. At last that blessed day has come. And I don't care where you come from. We're all moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. Moving on up. Moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. We're moving on up. I don't mind leaving here to show the world we have no fear. Cause we're a winner. And everybody knows it too. We just keep on pushing. Like your leaders tell you to. At last that blessed day has come. And I don't care where you come from. We're just gonna move on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. We're moving on up. You know, you may remember reading in your Jet Johnson publications. A whole lot of stations didn't want to play that particular record. We're a winner. Can you imagine such a thing? Well, I would say the way I'm sure most of you would say, we don't give a damn, we're a winner anyway. Right on? Yeah, I got a little strength out there tonight. Putting fire under us. Out of sight. It's all right now. We have just another version that we'd like to lay to you about here. Believing very strongly in the equality and freedom for all, and especially we people who are darker than blue. We'd like to just lay another version to you. Trying not to offend anyone, but basically telling it like it is. We're a winner, and never let anybody say, boy, you can't make it, cause a feeble man is in your way. No more tears do we cry. The black boy done dried his eyes. And they're moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. Moving on up. There'll be no more Uncle Tom. At last that blessed day has come. And we're a winner. And everybody knows it too. We just keep on pushing. Like Martin Luther told you to. And I don't mind leaving here to show the world we have no fear. Cause we're moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up. We're moving on up. So people get ready. I've got good news for you. How we got over like we're all supposed to do. Let us all say amen. And together we'll clap our hands. Cause we're moving on up. Moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving on up now. Moving on up. Continue to be a winner, all of you.
Well, that was short and sweet. So I suppose we're ahead of time, which is nice because that way we don't have to rush things. So yeah, could I ask Jonas and Natascha and Bini to join me here. Right, I think we're just all gonna sit here, or actually for the presentations, perhaps it's actually better if we will actually have trouble seeing your slides this way. I just thought of that. Yeah, okay, we're going to leave you alone for a while. I'll just introduce you and then, yeah, let's do that. Otherwise, we'll have to crane our necks. We didn't think this through, as you can tell. Okay, the first panelist, so we'll do it as follows. Each panelist first gets some time to do a little presentation, and then we'll go into a discussion mode with each other, but also, of course, with you. And our first speaker, and I'm really thrilled that she's here, is Natascha Sadr Haghighian, a Berlin-based artist and activist who, as many of you will know, well, has a solo practice, even though also as a solo artist she is many. She consents to not being a single being. She represented Germany this year in Venice as Natascha Sadr Haghighian. And she's also active in various constellations and groups and coalitions, such as NSU Complex Auflösen, which is the tribunal that I believe Tom already mentioned a couple of days ago. And yeah, I think she will use her multifaceted activities to think and talk about matters of collaborations, coalitions, individual artisthood, and so on and so forth. So Natascha, I'm really happy that you're here, and we'll join you later. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sven, and thank you all for coming. It feels funny that in order for us to do the panel, we have to leave each other alone. But yeah, so here am I. Yesterday we left on the note that there is an urgent need for solidarity. I think today is one of those days where it's especially felt, as I couldn't go to The Hague, but I think we are all kind of involved in thinking about how we can be in solidarity with this movement, and especially since violence is always felt differently by different bodies. It's also addressing bodies differently, and only in solidarity or through solidarity can we confront it, not in this individual way. So yes, the need for solidarity comes as a need to counter individualization in neoliberalism, as we heard yesterday, and also to counter the fascist tendencies that came back in some ways with the crisis of the neoliberal model. Solidarity is important. At the same time, I would like to propose a few points, a few maybe discussion points about what I encounter as challenges of being in solidarity, especially within the arts, which is a field that I work within a lot, and as well as in the art system, as well as in my artistic practice. I find it often a challenge how one can be in solidarity. And I want to take you through a few thoughts I have about this. In thinking about how to prepare for this talk, I came across a very old animation that I did back in 2001. And I felt that it might be a nice starting point to talk about the different forces that we encounter while we try to stay together. One of them just happened right now. And I would like to just, if we can play the video of this animation. It's called Vice Virtue. And it shows the animation of two images very simple depictions of a prison courtyard and a stage. And there's a centrifugal machine that rotates and kind of pushes out the different lines with, that the image exists of, and ends up in the other image. And so I call this vice virtue because these are two images of one of criminalization and one of reward. And the centrifugal spin, which is a scientific method basically to isolate elements, here separates and isolates what is considered good and bad, or what is considered special or individual, or for that matter, criminal, or the outcast, but also the talent. So it's this phantasma of something that can only be evaluated once you isolate it. Again, coming from a scientific method, but I think it's kind of useful here in understanding what kind of strain we encounter when we try to stay connected, a strain that decapacitates one's ability to keep oneself maybe knotted, as Liz Povinelli would say. I would also call it a loneliness machine, a machine that constantly drives you to either of these images. I think it's important to think this machine within also the amplification in social media, and also how it reaches a kind of rather totalitarian dimension in tracking and profiling, and one of its forms of the criminal complex predictive policing. So in its technological extensions of isolation or isolating mechanisms, it becomes a totalitarian machine. So how to develop techniques to work against this centrifugal force, how to resist it, or how to maybe be indifferent or fugitive, how to escape it, I think is very, very connected to the challenges of being in solidarity. Bini gave us yesterday a very precise analysis of how capital has been organizing individuals into former the Fordists, but then the neoliberal, or recently again very successfully the fascist orders. And I would say that as a status quo that that we've been grown up in, the centrifugal machine is part of keeping the status quo in place, to keep everyone where they supposedly belong. There is a fetish that is necessary to install this this isolation of the individual at play. The fetish is the individual itself, and as Marina Wischmidt has pointed out, and I would like to ask you to show this quote of Marina's paper, a quote from a paper that she gave at the White West conference last year at La Colonie, where she points out that the fetish of the individual, artist or citizen, and the sanctity of their property rights to their own speech and creative imagination is both a result of and a compensation for the total ban on thinking in terms of community, collectivity, or trans-individual responsibilities and harms that decades of neoliberal ideology as materialized, there's a typo here in materialized, sorry, in the conditions of everyday life has established as the absolute bedrock of whatever social contract we can still think about. The fetish of the sovereign individual means that fascists can organize wounded individuals who feel their individual rights are being infringed. And these wounded individuals, I think, are very are very to be taken seriously. And I think Bini has also traced them back in how they how they came about in under the regime of neoliberalism yesterday. So the artist here is mentioned together with the fetish of the individual, and I think you know also my own experience, this relates a lot to also the economy of the artist. So there is no countable or no measurable exchange value in the work of artists. The price of one's labor is not measured in like the hours that you worked or something like that, or payments don't come with, you know, in this exchange. But it's very much connected to the fetish itself. So that's why it's so tricky to form groups or to form any sort of, you know, other than the individual, because then it starts to be a problem for this economic model to celebrate the fetish, and then the entire economic model collapses. That's why we, you know, those of us who engage in collaborative and collective practices often end up teaching or doing other jobs, because this kind of work does not fit into the economy of the fetish individual. So seeing the artist as a blueprint for the neoliberal subject puts it also, or puts the artist subject also in this, in this neoliberal condition of constantly being in between or oscillating between self-love and self-loathing, or between excitement and anxiety. It's a position full of anxieties. And I think that, you know, when you trace the arts, you know, in the history of the arts, what kind of solidarity movements there have been, or, for example, what kind of unionizing there has been, you will find very, very little. Also in my personal experience, I encountered difficulties to organize within the arts. And I think that this is partially connected to this anxiety that comes with the position of the artist, this precarity. We've talked a lot about precarity, but I think anxiety maybe is more precise here. So in this, you know, again, centrifugal spin that puts us in this expectation of either being rewarded or being expelled. How can we insist on solidarity, or how can we be not just in this individual form? And I would maybe try to come to this question from a different, another complication of this, because even though, you know, I work in the arts, this is not what drives me. I'm not trying to be or to respond to this fetish, but on the contrary, I'm trying to find ways in which to be indifferent to it. So the motivations of engaging in artistic work is often not to play within that centrifugal machine, but instead, I would say, at least my motivation or aim is working towards pleasure or joy, and working away from depression, from speechlessness, feelings of helplessness, loneliness, and paralysis, which I think, is often a motor. How do you find your language again within, being furious about the status quo and being pushed by the status quo? So how do you push back? So there's, with this status quo being that there's often a feeling that joy is out of reach. The status quo being this strange, straining or pressuring, obfuscating, often threatening force that makes spaces, not enjoyable, I would say. In this sense, I would see this quest for joy or joy itself as a topological operation. The status quo kind of pushes and pulls this space, and you have to push and pull back. So in both, working towards joy, you need joy to create that space. I think we could put the slide of Silvia Federici here, because I thought that I encounter very often what she calls sad politics, where we expect from ourselves to be in solidarity, where we actually where we try to kind of lift a weight that is often too much for what we can actually do, and in the process, maybe are exhausted or even have a burnout. I often see that in attempts to be in solidarity. Maybe I just quickly read this. I'm a strong believer that either your politics is liberating and gives you joy, or there's something wrong with them. I've gone through phases of sad politics myself, and I've learned to identify the mistakes that generate it. It has many sources, but one factor is the tendency to exaggerate the importance of what we can do by ourselves, so that we always feel guilty for not accomplishing enough. So one thing that I observed, and I would not exclude myself, is that when we look at where solidarity starts, oftentimes it starts from a political urgency that where we expect from ourselves to respond. It feels very, very necessary and urgent to respond to a political circumstance. This is often then also mixed with the desire to help, what I would call the good intention, and a portion of empathy. And these I would consider pitfalls of solidarity, because they often come from this desire to change, to do something meaningful, or to do something that would change the conditions under which we work together or we live together, but it seems that it often creates a situation of sad politics, where we at some point just need to drop the cause and say, you know what, I can't do this. It's too much. It's or it ends up in misunderstandings or fights even in the groups that we find ourselves in. So I think it needs it needs a clarity to understand what are my stakes. What are my stakes when I'm in solidarity? And I think the stakes, how I understand them, if I think from a politics of joy, then they come from an understanding that is non-individual, that is an entangled, a resonant and a resonating existence that comes from a position of an entangled, resonant and resonating existence, which means that it is about being in tune, resonant being like, sending out waves, but also being moved and moving, and that in itself shows that solidarity then would not be something where you go out and help someone, but where you understand that when someone moves, you move too. Or as we saw a lot of quotes from Fred Moten, I think at some point he said, the understanding that this shit is killing you too, just much more slowly, you motherfucker. And I think that this is, this is where it starts to be a very, very different understanding of how what I would call collectivity, not a collective, but collectivity comes into the picture. Because even though we're in this centrifugal spin, there's actually other things, if we remember, like coming from a politics of joy or the quest for joy, there's other things that move us other than just the machine, the centrifugal machine of the status quo. And these forces, I think they create a sensibility for the entanglement, for the push and pull of what we're in tune with, or what we want to be in tune with. And this is what I would say I'm looking for, or I'm interested in. Maybe as another take on this, there was this wonderful lecture by Liz Povinelli just recently at the Sonic Acts festival, and she talked a lot about knotting, collectivity as knotting, and knotting not as a series of knots that are equal to each other. So we talked about equality yesterday also. So this is not about equality, but collectivity as a form of knotting, in which, so this is a quote from Liz, collectivity as a form of knotting in which certain spaces are able to control both the scale and circulation of the form of being in those knots. So this is about, again, this is movement, this is push and pull in relation to other knots and to other forces in those knots, and to make spaces. And again, I'm coming back to a topological, this being a topological operation. So the intelligence that is required to operate within this knotting, and to be part of a knot, and to work through also the complications of being different in this knotting. Liz Povinelli listed 4 axioms. She called them axioms of survivance. Survivance being a term that the indigenous cultural theorist Gerald Wiesenor first coined. I don't know if, can we go to the next slide just to see the, I think one more, yeah. So entangled existence as being, I think I'm a bit over time, so I'm maybe just really quickly, yeah, the axioms being entangled existence, which we talked about, and she says that this in itself is not so interesting, but it becomes interesting in connection to the other three, and this is I think an important one: the unequal distribution of the effects of power and the power to affect a given terrain of existence. And then the fourth one, to speak from somewhere specific and to provincialize Western ontologies. I think maybe to just name a few other forms of organizing or knotting in this scenario. I think that also in reference to the title of this panel, the forms of forming coalitions, alliances, and also collaborations and collectives, they all are very, very different in how they operate, what kind of conditions they produce, and also what kind of aims they would have. So they all come with very different dynamics and have their own pitfalls. But I think they are all expressions of a certain type of knotting. Maybe coalitions come into play in the arts when you want to push for a certain common demand. I was part of, or I am part of, at the moment, a little dormant coalition called Gulf Labor, which is a coalition of artists and cultural workers who have affiliations or stakes in the Middle East, and who, when the Guggenheim Museum decided to build a museum in Abu Dhabi, try to use this as leverage to negotiate conditions for the migrant workers who built that museum, and to say, we want to invite the Guggenheim to think about conditions under which, you know, the art that we think would be interesting to show there, it coexists with fair conditions for those who built it. This came with, you know, years of negotiations and eventually also a boycott that 2,000 artists signed. Maybe we can show just quickly the slide of the website so you can, I don't know if you can see it, but just to, if you want more information on Gulf Labor, you can go to the website to see what has been happening there. And maybe as an example for an alliance, a rather big one, Sven mentioned it already, the Tribunal Unraveling the NSU Complex was an alliance that I was part of for several years, and it was the attempt to create a civil movement to unravel what is a collusion between Nazi groups and the state in Germany, institutional and structural racism that came in the form of a terrorist organization or a terrorist group called the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, that operated in Germany for 10 years. Can you show the next slide, just to show this is from the tribunal, and the next slide is the website. So again, if you want to understand what the tribunal did, it is a continuous process. There was just a tribunal in Chemnitz, and the first tribunal happened in Cologne. And so the tribunal was trying to find a big alliance between activist groups and people who work in the arts to find languages and and stages and visibilities for the struggles that the families of the victims of the NSU had been trying to create, but were not heard due to the structural racism that exists in Germany. So this was really, countering or maybe, not countering in general, but creating an alternative to the courtroom in which the families did not find the justice that they were demanding. The tribunal resulted in also different side projects. One of them was the Society of Friends of Khalid, and in which we brought some of the results of the tribunal to Documenta. And I just want to, maybe we can show the next slide, just quickly talk about this as a form of collaboration, because what we did was we collaborated with Forensic Architecture, who had a big exhibition here at BAC several months ago. And I think, yeah. And this collaboration was effective because we worked with Forensic Architecture because of their specific ways in creating a certain type of visibility. At the same time, of course, the differences between their quite hierarchical structure and our grassroots structure also created, a challenge in this collaboration. And I think this is very often true for collaborations, that you work together for a short period of time, and you have to really define the terms under which this collaboration happens. I think maybe I stop here because I've been talking too long, but maybe I was able to put out some, or to lay out some of the problems that I see with, or challenges that I see within this field of solidarity. And yeah, I would hand over to Bini, or.
I have no presentation, so you can stay with me or come on the stage as if you, how you like. Okay. So, okay. Yeah, I think I won't talk too long because I talked very long yesterday. Thank you, Natascha, very much for your input, not only for getting more concrete in the discussion of the problems we already discussed yesterday, but also in facing the problems when we try to be solidaric with each other. And if we agree upon this principle that we want to be solidaric, or that we agree on being singularities that consent to not being singularities, or not having to be oneself all the time, then what are the obstacles that we are facing? Or to put it in different words, what keeps us apart? It's exactly what you, Natascha, described as this centrifugal machine, which of course resonates very much with the commodity form, with the capitalist market, and its individualizing power, be it through the norm, to the extraordinary, the different, the singularity, the ideal, or the deviant, the one that is punished for being different. And when listening to your presentation, especially in the beginning when you raised the problems, I was reminded of the Berkeley psychology department that has been doing some very interesting research on wealth studies. They have been looking into the psyches of the wealthy people trying to find out if there's something different, or like if wealth affects the psychological structure of subjectivity, or maybe it is the other way around. A certain psychological disposition leads to wealth. So, and they did like some very interesting and very simple experiments. For example, they positioned the camera and the pedestrian at the crossroads, and they asked the pedestrian to try to cross the crossroads, and then they were looking which car would stop and which not. And it's very simple outcome. The more expensive the car is, the less likely it is for the car to stop. Right? Very simple. Or they showed a group of different people, like rich people and poor people, pictures of faces. And they asked the people to identify the emotions in these pictures. And also the results were very striking. The wealthier an individual is, the more difficulty it has, they have to identify emotions. You know, if you're really wealthy, somehow you don't know what the people are feeling in front of you. And of course the explanation is very, very simple, because you don't have to. You know? You are not dependent on others as much as others are dependent on others. Because you are so wealthy, you can just buy whatever you want. You can buy their support. So this could be the explanation why wealthy people have very difficulties to behave in a what we call social way, right? And there's more experiments. You know, I could go on, but they are all very simple, and most of them are as funny as that one. And then the question, of course, occurs. Are these people so wealthy, so rich because they're somehow different, because they're evil? Or are they evil because they're rich? And so they did another experiment to find out which of the two it is. And for this, they had this game, this game Monopoly. You all know it. Whoever has played it, you know, it's a very simple game. It was supposed to be critical of capitalism in the first place, or of monopoles. And everybody who's played it knows, you know, there's this certain street. If you buy that, it's clear that you will win. The rest of the game is just boring, waiting for you to finally have all the money. So it's not really about being a good player. So, but they changed the rules of the game a bit. So, and it was always two participants playing, both like students with the same social background whatsoever. And they changed the rules so that the one player would have twice as much money as the other, and would roll two dices, you know, and whenever they cross start, they would get twice as much money. So you don't have to be smart to figure out who will win this game. It's completely clear. But what they saw on video recording the game was the person winning was speaking louder. They were playing more aggressively, you know, pointing their little fingers louder. They were talking much more than the other participant. And there were pretzels on the table. They were eating almost all the pretzels by themselves, you know. And then, when they interviewed the participants, the players, after the game, the people who won thought they won for a reason, and they made the right decisions, and they played very well, right? And this is of course fascinating. These people, the two players, had the same social background and whatsoever, gender, race, all the categories. And it took only 1 hour for them to think they were entitled to their social status and to behave completely differently than the other participant. And this, for me, is very much connected to the question you asked, Natascha, because it's the question, what are the rules of this game? And which desires, which behavior is put forward with these rules, and what kind of game would we have to construct? How would we have to change the rules in order to make it more attractive for the participants to behave in a different fashion? This, for me, is the question of this centrifugal machine. It's the question of the conditions of the choices we make, because the choices we make are not only about us, of our desires, our subjectivity, our ideology, our theoretical background. They're also very much about the social conditions, the relations we find ourselves in. And how could we change the relations, and how would the relations have to look like in order to make it more attractive to behave collectively, to behave solidaric, and not individualized as atoms. This means also, how would we have to change the rules to make it more attractive to have cooperation or collaboration in a solidaric, in an equal form? Because also it's important to mention that even the individualized artist, of course, is a part of a cooperation, right? We all know there's no single artist doing singularly their stuff. They all have a bigger factory and support network behind them, but this collectively, this cooperation is a hierarchical cooperation. It's not democratic, it's not equal, it's not based on libertarian principles, so it's not solidaric, but authoritarian in a way. So these are my remarks to the questions you put forward. And I wanted to go in a completely, not completely different direction, not talking about the material conditions so much, but also mentioning like ideological condition, obstacles in what keeps us apart, and addressing one of the main splits in the recent debates of the left, because neoliberalism is not only a society that splits us in individuals, but also in not only in singularities, but also in single issue struggles, you know, splits up in fragmented fights. So we have different groups of leftists pushing forward their special agenda, and then often finding themselves in a competition on which of these agendas, which of these topics is more important than the other. And one of the most important recent splits in the left is this split between what is called identity politics and what is called like social politics or class struggle, right? You know, the politics of recognition and the politics of, say, redistribution of wealth. And this debate has become very strong in the last years, especially after the election of Donald Trump, when some theorists or politicians claimed, well, there's no wonder that this proto-fascist won the election because the left has nothing to offer. They have been talking only about minorities all the time. They have been doing like cultural politics all the time, and they completely forgot about the working class. So my point is not going to be that this opposition is not necessary, and that we can do both identity politics and redistributional politics. But I want to say that the opposition itself is inherently wrong, that it makes just no sense. And why? Because that what is called the social struggle or the class struggle or the economical politics is itself or can itself be a completely identitarian politics, can be identity politics by itself. The most prominent example of an identitarian form of working class politics is the so-called worker state. You know, for 70 years there was such a thing as a state of the workers, a state of the peasant, and you cannot be more identitarian than to ground the whole state on the concept of the identity of a worker. It's like you can see this in many famous songs, for example by Brecht, you know, join us if you are a worker too. This is identity politics. So you can have class struggle in the form of identity politics. And at the same time, this what is called identity politics can be formulated as identity politics, but absolutely does not have to. I think it's completely wrong if one agrees to the assumption that feminism, queer politics, anti-racism, ecological politics, and so on are politics about identity, about recognition of difference, and so on. While in fact these politics are always concerned with power relations. What feminism and anti-racism and so on strive for, what they fight for, is a change in power relations. It's a change in social relations. This is not about identity. Identity is the form that the domination that those in power try to impose on those who suffer from the domination in order to split them up. So this, I would say, is a very simple example of what keeps us apart, because it's just like a problem of framing politics. It's a problem of theoretical, ideological perspectives, and we can, I think, get rid of this, what keeps us apart altogether, if we realize that this seems to be disconnected, seems to be completely different struggles, are in reality very similar struggles. Struggles that can be formulated in the form of identity, but do not have to, and struggles that deal with the power, deal with the participation, and deal with the question of equality. Who decides on what? Who is able to decide on their living conditions, and who is not? And this, on this, I think I want to end, because, for example, last week I was talking with a friend from the interventionist left. This is one of the strongest non-party leftist organizations, radical leftist organizations in Germany, and she was telling me that now this intervention left is discussing whether they should invest their resources in the ecological struggle or the anti-fascist struggle, right? And of course, it's a question that returns, and you have to think about these questions because you have limited resources. You cannot put all your energy in all the struggles. But for me, also the question is, do we have to answer it exclusively? And I myself, being also involved in what we call the digital anti-fascism, I would say that again here the question is posed wrongly, because what we could see is that as soon as the ecological movement, like I'm talking now about the Fridays for Future movement, right? If at the moment it showed up, fascism was declining, especially already in the media, in the debates, in the discourse, and in the attention. And this, I think that ecological politics is in a way eminently already anti-fascist, and for two reasons. First, because of the question of framing. It's very simple. As long as the media is talking about real problems, they cannot talk about fantasy problems. As long as they're talking about ecological problems, they cannot talk about race and migration all the time in the racist manner. And second is, of course, very strikingly that those who are mostly against any measurements taken against the climate change are, of course, the fascists, are the Bolsonaros and the Trumps of the world. So it is very clear, and I think we only have to make it even more clearer, if you want to fight the climate change, if you want to fight the climate catastrophe, of course you have to fight fascism, because they are the worst enemies of nature. And it's like one moment where I can think you can see very simply that it is possible to overcome that, what keeps us apart, that what splits us, and bring struggles together. That was it for me.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation that already started off in an extremely interesting way. Maybe just as a note to Maria's very important introduction, or her reading out of the KOZP, the Kick Out Zwarte Piet Manifesto. It is November. That means that all of us also need to pay our anti-Black Piet taxes. We do that through apura.org. It's a crowdfunding for the KOZP Solidarity Fund. You get, if you go beyond 20 euros, you get a tote bag. It says Kick Out Zwarte Piet. It's also really good in catching fascists, because they really tend to be drawn to this particular slogan. So it serves multiple functions in the process. I'm going to share just a few images and thoughts in relationship to Sven's articulation on the question for tonight: how structurally can different emancipatory movements and organizations collaborate? And of course, that I think always means first and foremost to acknowledge the fact that many emancipatory political movements, platforms, parties, of course, already exist in a continuous dialogical relation. Without Los Indignados, there would have been no Podemos, that since this week has started to form a government with the PSOE. Without the Occupy movement, there might not have been a Bernie Sanders presidential bid. Without Black Lives Matter, we might not have had the Squad in the American Congress today. So, and just as between non-parliamentary and parliamentary movements, there is this continuous dialogical formation or dialectical process taking place. This, of course, also counts for new transnational formations as well. For example, the Progressive International that was founded in 2018, that emerged as a collaboration between DiEM25 in Greece, Momentum, the grassroots base of Corbyn's Labour Party, and the Sanders Institute run by Jane Sanders, together with Bernie Sanders in the United States. The last weeks, we've also, when it comes to transnational solidarity, we have seen how solidarity actions in defense of the Rojava revolution in northern Syria, the coalition of Kurdish, Arab and Assyrian revolutionaries that is currently threatened by a brutish Turkish invasion, how solidarity actions in the Rojava revolution were initiated by indigenous representatives from Standing Rock, as well as Extinction Rebellion, and maybe in response to the previous talk, that also meant simultaneously that the Rojavans came out to join the Fridays for Future school strike just before the summer. So all of these examples, all of these dialectic examples of transnational emancipatory collaborations build, of course, on an emancipatory heritage. It's the heritage of the Communist International, with all of the necessary critiques that we need to have on it, have against it. No, not have against it, have with it. The heritage of the Pan-African Congress, Non-Aligned Movement, World Social Forum, Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations, which is the kind of alternative version, stateless version of the United Nations, with members of unrecognized stateless states, a heritage that says your oppression is mine and my liberation is yours. Of course, listing these examples very quickly is also as much a proof of existing emancipatory coalition building as all of the differences that exist between them, from the Rojavans' armed defense of a non-state democracy to the swarm blockades of the predominantly white urbanites of Extinction Rebellion. These are worlds of solidarity as well as political worlds apart in terms of tactics and objectives. But the aim when building popular fronts is to enforce egalitarian politics. It's not to acquire top to bottom sameness on every possible position. It is to articulate at first larger common interests and shared demands. And this maybe is a beautiful example of a training that was given by the Kurdish freedom movement, by the Rojavan revolutionaries, to Extinction Rebellion members within the Extinction Rebellion movement, and also in the UK, the Extinction Rebellion movement protested together with the Rojavans in front of the Turkish embassy. So when we talk of these broader coalitions, I myself have often found myself sided much more closely with progressive Muslims, progressive Christians, even though I'm not one myself. But as a socialist, I share with progressive peoples of faith that our lives are bound by a greater cause than individual interest alone. We believe in a common good. I can't say that for most liberals. I have much less in common with them, even though on this kind of formalistic idea of particular secularist idea, we might on a kind of from a distance. Not referring, they might, a progressive person of faith might refer to the idea of the collective through a deity. I do it through the notion of collectivity, but that doesn't stop us from, in that process we actually share more common than what potentially divides us. A beautiful example of someone that we worked closely with, also together with Bach, is Louis Yalandoni, a Filipino revolutionary that lives in exile here in the Netherlands, who was a priest in the Philippines at the time of the Marcos dictatorship, and joined the Communist Party as a priest. And when he was asked why, he said, because the Communist Party gave me a chance to practice my faith. Like, these two were never contradictory, they were complementary. An important role of art invested in emancipatory politics, from my perspective, is to imagine and create the spaces, the morphologies that can assemble common cause across particularities. That means to acknowledge difference, but as part of a process of identifying the shared front lines of what could be a popular front. And in my own work of the past years, of which I'm showing you a few slides, but I'm not going to go into details, that has taken the form of developing alternative parliaments for emancipatory political movements, or assembly designs, campaign designs for pan-European platforms like DiEM25, the creation of utopian training camps for art activists that share some similarities with the work of Jeanne van Heeswijk that she's presenting here. And I know there has been some rumors of a potential merger between my training for the future and her trainings for the not yet. But at this moment we can neither confirm nor deny these particular conversations. So this is about imagining the spaces, symbols, narrative of a new international, or a new transnational, or a new terrestrial, as Sven Lütticken proposed it recently in one of his eFlux articles. Imagining it is a first step in establishing it in order to move from collective imagination to political reality. Now, from my own... Oh, there's no back, sorry. From my own experience working with social movements, political parties, stateless organizations, it is clear that there is no lack of solidarity, or a lack of coordinated actions, or a lack of capabilities of imagining a new terrestrial, planetary form of emancipatory governance. Of course, progressive politics is littered with factionalism, but not fundamentally more than the right. Not fundamentally more than the right. Our practicing of international solidarity, of the inheritance of transnational platforms, internationalist platforms like the Comintern, like the non-aligned movements, remains much more solid than the half-hearted attempts of the Nationalist International, as we see exemplified here in the attempts of Steve Bannon to build coalitions of ultranationalist parties, alt-right parties across the European continent. The only reason why they work together so well is that they share a common desire to separate from one another. But after that initial separation, that is their only common ground, there's nothing or very little for them to actually build a common ground on. What we might lack more fundamentally, as Dilar Dirik, a representative of the Kurdish women's movement, said 2 weeks ago during a lecture at the TRICE conference in Athens, what we might lack more, she said, is a fear of imagining victory. To think of emancipatory alliance not just as a force of opposition or as the ever-shining alternative to an existing status quo, but as the foundation for a new durational planetary form of governance that transforms our understanding and practice of power and enforces a new egalitarian hegemony. This is what can be learned from our president, Evo Morales, who put indigenous socialism into national and international practice from 2006 to 2019, inscribing in the constitution of Bolivia the principles of the plurinational state that is embodied by the Viphala flag that became, in the period of Morales' governance, the co-official flag of Bolivia. policies that lifted millions out of poverty and that sought for a new ecology between indigenous communalism and the social components or social inheritance of the modernist project, until he was ousted in a criminal coup this week, brought about by multinational corporations, racists and religious fundamentalists, as generally tends to be the case. The right wing has their training camps in secretive castles, they have their think tanks, they have their meetings on the mountain of Davos, where they plot these coups to maintain ultranationalist and neoliberal hegemony. We need our own infrastructures, our own training camps, like Jean has brought into being here at the base, at the back, to contribute to the building of the Popular Front, to imagine victory and become those that share power in power. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Bini and Natascha. Let's all join Jonas. We have 2 mics here. Thank you so much. That was very rich, and I do think there's some very good resonances here and patterns. A little bit, yeah. Thank you. So yeah, what is keeping us apart, but also actually which sort of convergence of struggles may already be in the process of taking place. Jonas, you had a great Dila Dirk quote about the fear of imagining victory. That may be one issue. Maybe just to start us off, to kick off the discussion, I also was thinking about the modern, let's say, binary of the individual, the autonomous or sovereign individual on the one hand, and then the collective as its other, right? Sort of a caricature of the collective, the Soviet collective, where there's no individual freedom, or in a science fiction register, right? The Borg, let's say. But then, of course, we have a whole typology almost, or a topological typology of forms of collectivity in Natascha's talk, based on knotting, different forms of knotting subjectivities into collectivities. So coalitions, alliances, collaborations. I thought that was incredibly useful. I just want to basically ask you very briefly, just on a point of basic understanding, and probably me being terribly obtuse, but why, for instance, is the NSU-Komplex auflösen an alliance and Gulf Labor is a coalition? What's this sort of formal typological difference there?
Maybe it's a minor difference, but I think when you organize, it's very important to understand and to decide what kind of form your organizing will take. To consider what kind of aims you have and what are the resources that you have at hand. With the tribunal, it was an alliance of existing groups. So these were groups that were already in different places, involved in anti-fascist, anti-racist struggles, and also often formed in response to when the NSU uncovered themselves in the places where they had committed murders or bomb attacks. So these groups at some point formed alliances, an alliance in order to bundle the energies and become a movement. I consider this different from a coalition of individuals who continue their practice, but who form a coalition to reach a certain goal, which I think is at least with Gulf Labor, was a very, very precise goal in response to this ambitious move of the Guggenheim. And I think already in this, the complexity of bringing different groups together. In the case of the tribunal, it was, the core working group was already 100 people. Is working differently. Maybe the details are would take too long to explain. Yeah.
I think this as sort of bureaucratic almost as it may sound, I do think this is very important. It's important to be precise, right? And I think Bini also really made an extremely important remark, I think, when she says that neoliberal society splits us into these different atoms, these different individuals, but also into different groups, right, and different fights, certainly also on the ideological issue level, this issue or that level. But this process of splitting, of course, is a very real phenomenon, also in terms of, which organizational form do you use, do you find useful and do you develop? And then the matter, once again, becomes one of sort of recomposition also, right, and connecting different groups and organizations into alliances. So de- and recomposition, basically. By any means, also ask each other questions or engage each other in conversation. It shouldn't just be sort of me singling out, each of you individually. So hopefully this will become more transversal. So at any moment, if you want to butt in. Yes.
When listening to Jonas mentioning this amazing quote by Dila Dilek, our lack of the ability to imagine victory, right? I connected it back to your opening remarks, Sven, when you, as far as I understood, tried to describe this trap we often find ourselves in the anti-fascist politics, in the discourse, that often when we seem to be successful, the right, the fascists react with this self-victimization. Right? The fascist perpetrators now claim, look, we have been again made the victims, we are treated badly, the society, the liberal society is intolerant towards our intolerance. And my question is this really a trap, right? Should we really avoid this self-victimization of the fascists, or should we in a way go with them, Because this is a strange situation, the dominance of the victim in comparison to the defeated. It's like Enzo Traverso, the historian, he showed that in a way until, let's say, the 1970s or so, those were the main opposites, like the victorious and the defeated. And then it became the perpetrator and the victim. And at the same time, and I think it is connected to the defeat of the left, you had this Olympiad of victims, that people, that is this discussion, who is more a victim. So my question is, should we really avoid the self-victimization of the fascists, or should we say, plain along, say, yes, you have been made the victim here, and it's good that we defeated you, and we will defeat you again. You're not strong, you are weak, and we are stronger, because we will be the ones who win once again, like as we have proven in history once before.
I think that's a very good point. I think the question is indeed one of framing, right? And it's self-victimization. On the other hand, of course, it's also what has been known in Holland in particular as demonization, right? That's actually something the fascists used, we're being demonized. But of course, that is also very much a case of protesting too much, right? Because it is, of course, the nature of the game, so to speak, not monopoly, but sort of the game of the culture wars. So the question then is, okay, if they victimize themselves or put themselves in the position of the victim, how is the other side being framed, let's say, right? Is that a matter of sort of intolerant monsters who just have an evil agenda to destroy this or that? I think what I find interesting at the moment in the United States is indeed this again, this kind of demonization of the radical left, et cetera, and I think then it becomes crucial to say, okay, yes, but what is this radical left actually about, right? It's not actually this kind of bogeyman that you construct it to be. Yes, it is your enemy, sure. It is your enemy and it's victimizing you, but it actually has a certain agenda that gets to be, distorted, right? So how to sort of counteract that? To say, yes, we are your enemy, and this is our agenda, right? The agenda is not actually the agenda that you state it to be, right? It's again also this matter of how are facts constructed, right? That Tom Hollert spoke about. What is sort of the agenda of this supposed radical left? If somebody gets to be framed as a cultural Marxist conspiracy, well, yes, sure, it reflects the fact that maybe this is sort of the enemy of the fascists, but this framing of this enemy as, for instance, a cultural Marxist or as, whatever, is in itself, I would say, a certain spin on the nature of the opposition that this opposition then in turn needs to counter. Right. So, yes, sure, we're your enemy. Right. I think that's indeed not something one should deny. But who are we? Let's say.
Maybe I step in with a discussion that we had within the tribunal, as what in Germany is called the post-migrant society. And the discussions that we have within that, where there's a very strong discourse of integration, that and myself coming from a family of migrants, this fear that you shouldn't cause any trouble, you should you should be nice so that you don't upset the Germans, so that they would like you, and then you can live in peace, and that kind of turned around in the discussion, in the movement that started with Kanakatak and with other groups, to say no, actually, we have nothing to excuse ourselves for. We also don't have to be timid and polite and sit here and wait for the Germans to invite us. No, we're here and we're not going anywhere. And this was in the discussion towards the tribunal. It was really to boldly say, to send this message out to the fascists, to say, you know what, you've already lost, because we're here and we're not going anywhere, and this has already happened, so what you can cry, you can do whatever you want, but it's already done, we already live in a society that is shaped by migration, and that's also, we like that. so it's basically this victimization, to just ignore it.
But then also there's, this fantastic Fred Moten quote that you had, the understanding that this shit is killing you too, just more slowly, motherfucker, right? That to me is actually a really crucial point, a really crucial element in any kind of emancipatory politics, to build coalitions actually, but, to marginalize fascists, sure, but also to make the fundamental point that indeed there needs to be a horizon here, in a sense.
Yeah. I wanted to add something, because you mentioned again this anti-communism in the US, and you mentioned it yesterday already. And I would say this anti-communism has been there on a structural level all the time in the US, right? I mean, I myself, I'm a part of this collective called Jurfix Initiative Berlin. We do a series of talks for 20 years. This group has been doing this, and we were doing a series of talks on the topic of anti-communism. I found myself to be the one who argued anti-communism is a thing of the past, because since we have no strong communist movement, it was 2017-16, there's also no need for anti-communism, so this is a historical debate. And then I myself had a book published in the US called Communism for Kids, and there was a massive anti-communist shitstorm. I realized, okay, it's actually not a thing from the past, it's very, very present. But then something had changed in between. It's also the reason why why my book was published in the first place, is exactly what Jonas pointed out. There was this Occupy movement, and the Occupy movement changed the conditions of the public discourse. And now you had anti-communism and anti-socialism, but people now claimed to be socialist. For the first time in history, you could say in first time history in US American history, was a majority, at least of the younger people, agreeing that socialism is a good thing. So before you had always the public discourse, when for example I was watching the Daily Show and Jon Stewart, you always had to say, I mean, I'm not a socialist, but I'm of course in favor of higher taxes, or just the fact that I'm pro-equality doesn't make me a socialist, right? And now people say, yeah, I'm for higher taxes, and this is already a good step in direction of socialism. Right? So this is also the reframing that happened. Due, of course, not to Bernie Sanders or AOC, but due to the Occupy movement, who put out this strength.
Shall we open it up to the audience? Or? Yeah.
I was still thinking about what you were saying, Bini, about this, the construction of the enemy figure, in particular fascist alt-right discourses, because from a propaganda perspective, the aim when you create this kind of culmination of the secretive alliance of cultural Marxists and genderists and globalists, and it's to create a kind of multi-headed enemy, of which you actually know that they are not really in power, that they're not collaborating, and that also makes them very easy to defeat when you need to declare victory. Like, it's a really good strategy to have an enemy that you actually know is not really the enemy. And I realized it myself quite often when in the kind of wave of anti-cultural Marxism in the Netherlands, there's this discourse of, and they're working through the university trying to collectivize the state from within. And I think, I wish, like, that would be great. I'm totally in favor. I'm 100% for it. I wish there was a secret conspiracy. Please tell me where. Because that's, I mean, the only thing I see in the university, and I had the unfortunate experience of having one foot in Leiden University, which is where the whole the law faculty bred this the current the largest alt-right political party in the European elections in the Netherlands, the Forum for Democracy of Thierry Baudet. So. So there seems to be something double. On one hand, there needs to be a need to demythologize. Like, that's actually not the enemy figure, that this enemy figure only benefits your narrative. But on the other hand, they're also always describing potentialities that I would be very much in favor of. Like, I would love a coalition between cultural Marxists and genderists and whatnot. Like, I mean, that sounds exactly the place where we want to be, where I want to be. At the same time, you also don't want to give them the legitimacy of saying, yeah, this is exactly what it is, because that allows for forms of crackdown that we're seeing now with our friends in Hungary and in Poland, where exactly the same logic is being used to defund universities, to crack down on activist spaces, to imprison activists, to etc. etc. Like, if you are saying that you are really that threat, then you also need to be able to act upon the power that is ascribed to it. Otherwise, yeah, there's also a risk. Which is not to denounce your proposition, which I think is actually totally right, but then I'm thinking also of the reality in some cases where severe state violence is imposed on the non-existing, not yet functional coalition.
Yeah, and indeed, there's a certain joy and liberation to be had from saying, yes, we're exactly what you think we are, we're your worst fear, right? But then I think, yeah, the sort of
no sad politics in that.
That, in a sense, is sort of an opening move, I would say, right? It's very joyous,
to
yes.
To declare, yes, we are the cultural Marxists, and we're coming to get you. Absolutely.
Yeah. But then that would be, I would say, that's sort of an opening move for a script yet to be written. Shall we open it up? I can imagine there's quite a few comments, questions, interventions. Yeah. Okay. We have yet more microphones.
Thank you. Thank you all for the lovely contributions. It's not a question, rather just a note on Bini's comment. I mean, for me also, we should take into account the fact that there is a large part of the population, of the we or the them we don't know yet, that is quite into a state of apathy and detachment without necessarily being the rich that is eating all the pretzels, or the completely disenfranchised either minority or non-binary or you know, anything that is not heteronormative and conservative. And for me, it's possibly the coalitions that we should be seeking beyond the ones that are the obvious ones. We should try to kind of patch the little differences there, but possibly is to kind of drag these large parts of the population from this apathy. And I was just wanting some comments in relationship to technology, and how do you think technology, and particularly because you mentioned, Bini, also your digital activism, which I must admit I haven't heard before as a term. Maybe that's just me. So I was just wondering whether you have any comments in relationship to technology, what, you know, how much space is there and how much we, whatever that we is, could appropriate, etc.
Well, I think, yeah, I should. Where shall I start? Okay, let's start with the question of digital anti-fascism, because it's one thing that struck me 1 year ago or so, when the situation in Hungary worsened, and then there was the election in Austria. It was very horrible, and then we had Seehofer in Germany, and we posed ourselves, of course, over and over again the question: why is the right becoming stronger? And we already knew, okay, the digital world seems to play an important role in this. And there's one thing that we came to realize. Whenever the fascists march in the city, on the streets, then we organize a demonstration against it, right? And as long as we're more than them, we often succeed, which was the case in Berlin for several times. But whenever they troll in the internet, usually my friends, colleagues, and comrades, they tell me, just don't read it. You know, you will get headache, and this is just fascist bullshit. Don't engage with it. It's not rational, and so on and so on. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So we just retreat. But you see a clear dialectics there in state. I saw that when, for example, I was invited in a radio station, Deutschland Radio, big radio station in Germany, and talking to one of the journalists, and they said that when they meet together to discuss the program, then of course everybody draws from the comments in like the Facebook threads, and they said, but our readers think that and that, our listeners think that. That's not your listeners. That's an organized fascist group. And the only way to deal with this is in an organized manner. So this is exactly what we think is necessary to do, is to organize in groups, let's say Telegram groups or WhatsApp groups or whatever you find the right way to do it, and collectively oppose and collectively engage in the debates. So that, for example, you have a group, and then everybody who's member of the group can post, hey, look here on this Facebook article, or under this Facebook article, there's a debate, and there's the racist again. Let's go in there and defeat them. And then again comes the question, okay, what is the best strategy? And this is what we've been discussing here so far. I think in the times of crisis, you cannot defend the status quo. And anti-fascists now often find themselves as the defenders of the current situation, you know. So the fascists attack, and we try to form broad alliances, and we say, but no, the law is different, and we have the constitution, and so on, and democracy, blah, blah, blah. I think in the time of crisis, you cannot defend the status quo. It's exactly the lesson that Hillary Clinton has taught us, you know. She was the defender of the status quo, and she lost. Because it is a situation of crisis. The only way to defend fascism is with an attack. So in order to get these people who are in apathy, you know, you have to formulate a dream, a desire, a program, you have not to say what you're against, but you also have to say what you're for, and you have to appear somehow as victorious. You have to make this claim. We want to succeed, and this is the alliances we want to form, and this is our project we want to bring forward.
Yes.
Couldn't
agree
should
more.
I talk? Hi. So again, it's not a very clear question, but a question with a comment I'm trying to formulate in my head. But it's about also the last thing, Johannes, you said, which is the fear of victory. And trying to think, is it actually a fear or is it a legitimate question of how to think of ways of holding political power? And I was thinking in relation to what Bini was saying in her, how she started her talk about these psychological experiments, which I'm not really in favor of this idea of that there is a human nature that we're trying to discover, but even if it's socially constructed or a human nature or whatever you want to take approach to that, but the idea that there might be some trails in the human behavior that comes to dealing with power makes the question of whoever holds the power, it's not about getting there, but it's also about what kind, like how to deal with actually being the person in power and not to recreate circles of exploitation. And I was thinking also that it's still legitimate with the history of the left and different versions like communism or socialism, welfare state, like all these trials also is a heavy history that you have to consider this question of like, how am I going to be in power and I promise not to recreate these circles of exploitation. And I might add that it just comes from, or maybe it's a bit better because it comes from a failure of a personal experience in Egypt after the 2011. I remember that a lot of movement failed because the moment we got to be able to negotiate with the existing power or to run even some ministries, or it really failed because everyone was afraid or had to somehow to deal with recreating these political games, and suddenly everyone was like leaving, supporting these groups. So I think my point is that it's not really a illogical fear as much as a legitimate question of how to think the nature of power and what it does to the human, and how the left or the progressive left propose a different understanding of of holding power or political power.
I can start. I think you're absolutely right. It is very legitimate and very reasonable to be also skeptical about victory. In studying the history of the radical left, this is especially studying the history of revolutions, I call this the revolutionary dilemmata that revolutionaries find themselves in. There's like two possibilities, two possible outcomes of a revolution that they cannot want. And one is defeat, and the other one is failure. And in the historical example for the defeat is the Paris Commune. You know, it was a very nice revolution, and then the reactionaries came in and killed most of the revolutionaries. And the Paris Commune was also like very important example for the Bolshevik communists, because it said exactly this, what they did not want to repeat. Was their biggest fear was that they also would be slaughtered by counter-revolution. So they decided, whatever happens, we will not be the victims again, and we will create a counter-revolution. And they were successful with this, because their revolution was not defeated by war, was not defeated by counter-revolution, was not defeated by imperialist powers. But in the process of defending themselves against the enemy, they themselves became similar to this enemy. They became themselves more authoritarian, and therefore they were victorious, you know, but they failed against their own expectations. They failed what they were planning to do. So this is the revolutionary dilemma, and then we have to think, how can we manage to sail between those two options that we cannot want? How can we be victorious without becoming similar to our enemy? And I think, like for example, for the Russian Revolution, there were some historical options, but of course they were very difficult. But you have to look very close to find them.
Oh yeah, yeah. And with the Russian Revolution, it's also so difficult because there are so many effective propaganda narratives that suggest this was the only possible outcome, and there were so many possible outcomes. And I think maybe to just as a mention to what the role of art can do also in the context of these kind of propagandistic historiographies. I don't know if you read the China Miéville's October. China Miéville is, for those who don't know, is a science fiction writer, but he's also quite a prominent leftist in the UK. He co-founded the Popular Unity Party, and he wrote a book based on actual manuscripts that reconstruct the days leading up to the October Revolution, but really like as a script almost, and it's striking and gripping how one telegram that would have arrived or would not have arrived, or one miscommunication less than another, would have turned the tides completely. And that is not to bypass the horrors of Stalinism, for example, or to be revisionist in any form or way. It is just also not to fall into the trap of the idea of the inevitability of history, that in retrospect it is always very easy to draw straight lines. You see, in the end we always reproduce the horrors of power of. But then the fact that in 2019 we can talk about terms like equality or egalitarianism, and no one starts to laugh out loud because of how ridiculous such a proposal would be, that's the heritage of popular struggle. That's the heritage of emancipatory governance. That's the heritage of what might have failed to one extent, but has changed our common imaginary of what we can demand as normative reality. That it's possible to demand, I mean, as problematic as concepts of human rights are, for example, the fact that we can somehow mention them without starting to laugh, is a result of common struggle. Of course, in the case of the uprisings in Egypt, we also see a situation in which in this case the Muslim Brotherhood had plotted and prepared and was ready for power, had victory in mind for a long time. Not to say that the Muslim Brotherhood should necessarily be here the example to follow in terms of organizing for the next moment of rupture, where it's possible to change scenarios left or right. But that level of structural preparation, that level of being able to not only imagine the alternative, but imagining to collectively inhabiting and governing that alternative, of course, makes a difference. And especially for emancipatory politics, it's so important because our claims to power tend to be a demand to transform power as we know it, exactly not to reproduce structures of hierarchy and oppression as we already know them. So it also makes it a much more complex ecology of power. It's much easier to take power if your plan is to reproduce an existing infrastructure. And when it comes to the institutions that plot and plan, the Muslim Brotherhood is a good example. Now the military is a good example, as we saw with the squashing of many of the popular leftist governments in South America, and the one of Morales in particular. The democratization of the army, the democratization of the monopoly of violence would be a really crucial one in the context of the Roosevelt Revolution. I personally witnessed an army that was a people's army, that was organized on one hand, but also elected within the army, in which fighters elect their own commanders, in which the army is not separated from a larger a collective governing body as those who will always do what they are asked to do. No, they are asked first and foremost to embody a particular ideological commitment and then put it to practice like any other cooperative community or self-governing people's council or defense unit does. So and part of the answer might also be to train and practice the models in which such components, the durational components, administration as well, administration, bureaucracy, the army, those are, I think, are institutions that really demand for us to rethink from a perspective, plot, plan, and train in preparation of the moment that, in the example that you gave, was taken by those who were trained best at that moment.
This is indeed, no, I think that's brilliant, but I'm also reminded again of Bini's discussion of monopoly and games, right? Indeed, what kind of game is this in relation also to taking power, transforming the structures of power, building in, let's say, safeguards against the replication, the reproduction of existing hierarchies. So how would we have to change the rules of the game? How would we have to redesign the game or create new structures in order to have people behave differently, right? I think that's crucial to also get beyond the sort of stereotypical opposition between a kind of bargain basement type anarchism that's all about smashing the state, smashing the structures of power on the one hand, and a kind of equally cartoonish sort of communist Leninist version of just simply taking over the state on the other hand, right? That would be, I think, probably something that would have to be the point of departure, I think, for contemporary emancipatory politics on that scale of formal planning and plotting and designing, let's say. Do we have more? We really, as usual, we can't really see anybody. Yeah. Whitney. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for all of your talks in this discussion. I don't have a question, which is rude, I know, but I just wanted to say one small thing, since there was a few things that were asked after, which was where genderism and cultural Marxism might meet, and where there's been scripts being written for being the worst enemy and using it and being the monster, and those would be often in different feminisms and queer practices. These scripts are being used and being written, so that's a place to look. Get into it. I mean, some examples of, for instance, where like what would be called genderism and cultural Marxism in feminist legacies would be specifically, I guess, one main example, the Combahee River Collective, a group of socialist Black lesbians. And a lot of like gay and queer movements have actively embraced being nightmares, being monsters, being non-subjects, and utilized those positions also within different like theory, of course, but also like physical demonstration and activist protest practices, artistic interventions, and things like that. So there are elements of these kinds of scripts and practices that are established and have coalition and legacies and are still currently utilized, activated, expanded upon, troubled, and all of these things, of course, as well.
Thank you. Yeah, anybody want to? Good.
Before you speak, I wanted to make a suggestion. Can we change the light in this room, because we can't really see you, and it's kind of sad because
it's always the same problem when we have to.
That would be nice.
No, this is Guantanamo.
It's funny, of course. We're talking about this equality and non-hierarchical situations, and it's very very difficult to engage in a discourse. Because we're somehow blinded from your presence. I wanted to agree with you, what you said, that, and I think maybe one of the reasons why it is so so meaningful, why it makes so much sense to draw from the experiences of the queer feminist movement is exactly because it has been so very successful in the last decades. It's something that we often tend to forget, and therefore it's also can be joyful to read the right-wing press, right? For example, when this Manif pour tout emerged, remember when the gay marriage was introduced in France. There was this Manif pour tout. Then it also came to Germany, the Demo für alle. And when you read their text, it's really like some of them woke up one morning and realized, damn, the gays have taken over the world. The family is destroyed. Abortion is legal. And there was one theorist, like 20 years ago, wrote a book that declared that gender is an illusion. You know? And in a way, they are right. This is exactly what happened. Queer feminism has been a very successful movement over the last 30 decades. And this is exactly the reason why it is the feminist movement, now together with the ecological movement, that have been the strongest anti-fascist movements, right? This women's march in the US, whatever you might discuss in particular about demands and so on, was like the biggest demonstration that has happened in the United States until this day. Right? It was a very, very strong mobilization, and the same goes true for the feminist strikes happening in Spain and Latin and South America. They are very, very strong movements, and they can only be so strong because the queer feminist movements of the last decades has enabled them or us to speak out so loudly, differently from 50 or 100 years ago, right?
Let's see. Okay, we can see slightly better now. Are there any other Wortmeldungen, as we say in the East? It seems not. Let me then perhaps kind of try to link this this issue also back to the question of promises, or as Bini put it just now, formulating a dream, a desire, a program. My question would be, how can these sort of monsters, right? How can these worst nightmares in various coalitions formulate dreams, desires, programs that also can, let's say, draw people in who may not be monsters yet, or who may not realize it yet, right? Also in, again, returning to Moten's quotation, as mentioned by Natascha, about how this is, killing you too, only more slowly, motherfucker, right? What I find interesting about that is that it does establish a relation. It does establish a relation between, let's say, the monster, right? The one who is othered, and the one who sort of is in the position of the supposed sovereign subject, right? It's killing you too, right? This too establishes a certain relation. So my question would indeed be how the various monsters, how the various others can sort of interpolate, let's say, the non-monsters or the potential monsters, the ones who are in denial, the ones who think indeed that they can be part of sort of the fortress that can be held, right, against the onslaught. How can this too sort of be? How can that become part of the new rules, right, of the game that is being redesigned? Am I making sense? I know this is probably one of those terrible questions that that we're not going to be able to answer quite obviously, but this is one of those terrible questions that sort of keep nagging me and that keep bugging me, sometimes at night, often during the day.
Well, maybe it depends on whether you want a formula or a concrete.
Of course, not a formula.
Experience. I mean, I guess mobilization is a crucial question for any movement. But just as like a kind of a very simple, concrete example of an experience, when again going back to the tribunal, watching the Nazis in the trial in Munich, having a blast, with their lawyers sitting there and being extremely comfortable and knowing that this trial would not lead to anything that threatens the movement or the existing structures within the Nazis and their support network. It felt so disempowering and so defeating to having to watch that, and when the alliance formed that was in preparation for the tribunal, alone these meetings that lasted for over 3 years, but where you would sit and think about other spaces of speaking, other spaces of witness testimony, other spaces of visualizing the structures that needed to be addressed and attacked. That already was what created a complete game changer in how you then perceived what was happening in that court, because it was not, it didn't feel like a defeat any longer, it didn't feel like unanswered, but you were already working towards a different language, towards a different form, a different space, and not being crushed by that space that pretended to be where justice was promised to be done, but it was so obvious that that was a farce. So I think in this very simple move of coming together and deciding let's do otherwise, it suddenly made space for all for all the monsters that were just like in front of the television being scared, like, oh my God, like I can't watch this any longer. So making space for, for all the otherwise. So very very simple. It already felt different in that very moment.
Yeah, no, very simple, but very precise and very important in its at least apparent simplicity. Thank you so much. Are there any other interventions or thoughts on the basis of what has been said so far?
I mean, your question is of course incredibly large, but I think it's, or at least what I tried to when I was preparing some of the images and thoughts for this discussion, to acknowledge that it's already happened, I think is quite important. To acknowledge that there are these dialogical movements, and when people start pointing out, yeah, but the squares are empty here and the squares are empty there, what happened to this or that movement? To point out that there's these genealogies and dialogical movements that go from the squares to places that might be less public or less obvious. I mean, the digital anti-fascist movement is, of course, could be a fantastic example of things that might be less apparent but are absolutely happening, and that even though we might not be in power the way our opponents are in power, that so many ideas and concepts and references, the fact that we can even use them today and still have a conversation about them, are part of that let's say victorious process somehow. But nonetheless, I think the training camp in the context also here of Jean's project is important, because it's about being prepared. It's also about knowing who your friends are, so that because building coalitions in the end also always start from affective relations, friendships, trust. Many movements also, one of the first things state apparatus tries to do when they are actually afraid of you is to put people in your midst that you might think are your friends, turn against you, make you wary of your affective relations, of your bonds, of your friendships, of your comrades. That is the first step towards disintegration. So knowing who your friends are will be really important. And I think in the end, but it's the most difficult part, but to acknowledge there will be force. To become victorious means there will be force, because redistributing and transforming power is not in the interest of those who are in power. Winning elections on a left-wing platform can already get you ousted like this. So let alone thinking of winning power in forms that would enable forms of life unimaginable for the status quo now. This is, of course, why we referenced Rojava. Also, Maria referenced Rojava several times this week. The reason that the second largest NATO army of Turkey is invading Rojava is not because they pose a direct physical threat, but they pose a threat for a possibility of a different form of life, for a possibility of a different form of living. So we will need to be prepared for that aspect as well, and that will not go. Our opponents won't follow silently or willingly.
I would want to go back to what Natascha said about the tribunal, because I also attended the tribunal in Cologne, and I also experienced this as an extremely strong moment when those who were hurt by Nazis or who lost friends or family through Nazi terror spoke out in public and telling to the public, to the audience, what they had suffered, but in a way that did not victimize them at all, but empowered them. Right? While the audience was listening, and through listening and sharing also their pain, gave back also some strength, an experience of being heard that they had been missing in Germany all the time, because, as you might know, the police investigations accused those who suffered from the Nazi attacks instead of the Nazis. And this way of dealing with being hurt, or the dealing of feeling pain, of being weak and being hurtable, violable, is what I think is special about the leftist program, and has to be put forward in contradiction, in opposition to the right wing, to the fascist program. Because in a way, the fascist program, as is also in one of the quotes that you showed, is reacting to the situation of weakness in a crisis, and is offering an imagined community of strength. What they say is, okay, in reality, you might be weak, you might be unemployed, you might feel betrayed, but just imagine that you're part of the collective of white, of males, or let's say, for example, Germany, one of the strongest states of the world. Just identify with those in power, identify with the billionaires, and then you also will feel empowered. But it's, of course, first it's based on a lie, and then it is based on the exclusion of weakness, and the exclusion of the exterior, the inferior. And this exclusion will create a situation of being haunted. You feel strong because you're stronger than those who are weak, and you will constantly try to exclude that what is weak into the other, and then you always will feel haunted. They could come and infect you again with this weakness. And the left has a different idea of how to deal with the weakness. We do not exclude it. We accept the fact that we can be weak, that we can be hurt, that we can suffer pain, and this is the foundation from which we organize and from which we can find strength. Not in denial of this situation, but with it. And this, then we can find a universal community which is not based on exclusion, and therefore is not open to this haunting of the specter of weakness.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Here. Let's see. We are slightly ahead of time, I think, because we were sort of running earlier on. I think Bini's words are, so beautiful and so central, so quintessential, that I would be tempted to end on them, unless we have more urgent questions. We can, of course, also continue to discuss things over drinks. What is the consensus, if there is one? If there is no public question anymore right now, then we will end it here. Let me just thank our speakers, our panelists, who were all brilliant, and I think that we have articulated, at the very least, certain key issues. We have also sort of run the gamut from very concrete, specific examples of practices and projects and forms to fundamental questions that will remain unanswerable to some extent, but that we have managed, I think, to sort of also link back to those practices in order to show how those practices are actually indeed informed by also certain progressive emancipatory leftist ways of posing the questions, right? Yeah, I think Bini has once again reminded us of that at the end. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bini. Thank you, Natascha. Thank you, Jonas. And yeah. Tomorrow there is no evening program, but tomorrow we have one final debate in the afternoon with Kader Attia, with Diana McCarthy, Patricia Carstenhout, and Dan McQuillan, and it will be moderated by Dina Mohammed. So I hope to welcome all or most of you then.